Reindeer herding in the Arctic Circle, an emblematic part of the Sami way of life, people who live across borders in the polar region, present in Norway, Finland, Sweden and Russia.
You think you understand the world. You have seen the news, read the articles, watched the documentaries. You have convinced yourself that humanity holds no more real surprises. But right now, as you read this, there are people living on this planet who have never touched a light switch. People whose bodies function in ways Western medicine is still struggling to explain. People who have deliberately killed every outsider who ever came close to them, and who were completely right to do so. The undiscovered world is not somewhere out in space. It never was. It is here. It is now. And what follows is a list of 10 tribes that left scientists, soldiers, missionaries, and governments genuinely unsettled. Not because these people are primitive, but because when you look closely at what they built, what they survived, and what was done to them, something in your understanding of civilization begins to crack. These are not history lessons. Every single one of these stories is still unfolding today. Number 1, the Korowai, the people who built the sky. 40 meters above the ground, in the swamp forests of southwestern New Guinea, a family is eating dinner. Below them, the jungle floor is invisible in the darkness. Above them, nothing but canopy. They are in their home, a structure of woven bark and timber, balanced on a single living tree, high enough that the creatures they fear most cannot reach them. The Korowai of Papua, Indonesia, did not build their tree houses for tourism. They built them for survival. Their traditional enemies, they believed, were the Laleo, demon-like creatures who walked upright, wore no skin, and arrived without warning to steal children and spread disease. When Dutch missionaries first made contact with the Korowai in the 1970s, the community's first coherent response was not hostility or curiosity. It was the calm, practical assumption that these pale-skinned strangers were Laleo, and the question was simply what to do about it. The Korowai had developed one of the most sophisticated tree construction traditions on Earth, raising platforms 40 meters into the canopy with no metal tools, no blueprints, and no margin for error. A house that failed was a family that fell. Every joint, every binding, every load-bearing branch was the accumulated knowledge of generations. The structures have survived storms that leveled lowland villages. Engineers who have studied them describe them not as primitive shelters, but as solutions to an engineering problem that modern construction still does not fully replicate. They were also, for most of their documented history, practitioners of cannibalism, not as ritual, not as ceremony, as punishment. A person identified as a Kakwa, a witch believed to have killed a community member by eating their life force from the inside, was convicted, executed, and consumed. The logic was precise. You destroyed what had destroyed you. You eliminated the threat completely and absorbed its power in the same act. When anthropologists arrived in the 1980s and began documenting Korowai society, the outside world greeted their reports with a combination of horror and fascination. Television crews followed. Journalists followed the television crews. And then came the guides, the tour operators, the adventure travel packages offering paying customers the chance to visit a real tribe in real tree houses deep in the real jungle. The Korowai who agreed to be photographed received trade goods. Those trade goods created economic dependencies that their traditional society had no framework to manage. The tree houses nearest to access routes became tourist attractions, reconstructed, maintained not for living but for visiting. The Korowai furthest from those routes remained largely untouched. The border between these two worlds runs through the middle of the same community. In one direction, a man in traditional dress poses for a photograph. In the other, his cousin is building something 40 meters high that no tourist will ever see. What disturbs researchers most is not the cannibalism. It is the speed. A society that survived for thousands of years in isolation began visibly fracturing within a single generation of sustained outside contact. The Laleo, it turned out, were real. They just arrived with cameras instead of claws. Number 2. The Pirahun, the language that broke a scientist's mind. A linguist named Daniel Everett arrived in the Amazon in the 1970s as a Christian missionary. He had a wife, children, and a complete theological framework for understanding reality. By the time he left, his marriage was over, his faith was gone, and he had published research that split the entire field of linguistics into two hostile camps that have not reconciled since. The Piraha are a small community of hunters and fishers living along the Maisi River in the Brazilian Amazon. They number fewer than 800 people. They have no written language. They have no creation myth. They have no words for colors, no counting system, and no way of expressing any concept that does not connect directly to something a living person has personally witnessed. That last point is the one that detonated everything. Every human language ever studied had been found to possess what linguists call recursion, the ability to embed one idea inside another, to talk about things that are not present, to describe the past, imagine the future, tell stories about people who are not in the room. The Piraha language does none of these things. It cannot. It is built, at its grammatical core, on the principle that only direct experience is real. You cannot say in Piraha that your grandfather told you something. You can only say what you personally have seen or heard. Everett spent years trying to translate the Bible for the Piraha. He ran into the same wall every time. The Piraha would ask him if he had personally met Jesus. He said no. They asked if anyone alive had. He said no. They concluded, with complete logical consistency, that stories about Jesus were not the kind of stories worth taking seriously. The stories were about someone no living person had witnessed. Therefore, by the grammar of Piraha reality, those stories did not have the same status as real information. Everett's conclusion that the Piraha language disproved Noam Chomsky's foundational theory of universal grammar, the theory that all human languages share a deep common structure, produced a scientific firestorm that consumed careers on both sides. Chomsky's supporters insisted Everett had misanalyzed the data. Everett's supporters insisted the Piraha proved that language is shaped entirely by culture, not by any universal human cognitive program. The Piraha themselves were unaware they had broken anything. They continued hunting, fishing, and living with a consistent, documented happiness that researchers struggled to explain. A people with no creation story, no concept of the afterlife, no way of expressing anxiety about the future, and no mechanism for dwelling on the past, scored consistently as among the most psychologically contented communities ever studied. The missionary who went to save them walked out of the jungle an atheist. He has said publicly that the Piraha taught him that the absence of the things Western civilization considers essential to human meaning, history, religion, progress, narrative, was not a deprivation. It was a different solution to the problem of being alive. Whether that solution is wisdom or limitation is a question Everett has never been able to answer. He is not sure he ever will. Number 3. The Ainu, Japan's invisible first people. There are people alive today in Japan who are genetically distinct from the majority Japanese population, who descend from the original inhabitants of the archipelago, and who were subjected to a campaign of cultural erasure so thorough that the Japanese government did not formally recognize them as an indigenous people until 2019, not 1819. 2019. The Ainu are the original people of Hokkaido, Sakhalin, and the Kuril Islands. Before the Japanese state expanded northward in the 17th and 18th centuries, the Ainu had lived across a territory stretching from the northern tip of the main Japanese islands deep into what is now Russia. Their language is a complete isolate, not related to Japanese, not related to any other known language on Earth. Their physical appearance is markedly different from ethnic Japanese. Heavier body hair, deeper set eyes, broader facial structure. For centuries, Japanese scholars cited these differences as evidence that the Ainu were not fully human. Their relationship with the natural world produced one of the most sophisticated ecological cosmologies ever documented. Every animal, every river, every mountain was inhabited by a kamui, a spirit capable of existing simultaneously in the natural world and in a divine realm. Bears were not simply bears. They were the physical form taken by a powerful kamui who had chosen to visit the human world wearing a bear's body as a disguise. The most sacred ceremony in Ainu culture, the Iyomante, involved raising a bear cub from birth as a member of the family, feeding it, sheltering it, speaking to it, and then, in a ceremony of formal apology and gratitude, killing it and sending its spirit back to the divine world carrying gifts and messages from the human community. The Japanese government banned Ainu cultural practices in 1899 under the Former Aborigines Protection Act. The law designated the Ainu as former Aborigines, a legal category designed to imply that their distinct identity had already ceased to exist, and required them to assimilate into Japanese society, adopt Japanese names, speak only Japanese, and abandon their traditional lands for government-assigned farming plots. For most of the 20th century, identifying as Ainu in Japan meant accepting social stigma severe enough that entire families hid their ancestry from their own children. Grandparents who knew the ceremonies did not teach them. Parents who remembered the language did not pass it on. The knowledge did not disappear because it was forgotten. It disappeared because it was deliberately not taught as an act of protection toward the next generation. Today, researchers estimate that fewer than 10 people are fluent native speakers of the Ainu language. The Japanese government has launched preservation programs. Cultural centers have been built. A national Ainu museum opened in 2020, but a language spoken fluently by 10 elderly people cannot be revived by a museum. What was spent across 2 centuries of systematic suppression cannot be recovered in a decade of state-funded programming. The Ainu are not ancient history. They are people who are alive right now, in Japanese cities, many of whom do not know what their grandparents were. 4. The Chimbu, warriors who became ghosts. When Australian patrol officers first entered the highlands of Papua New Guinea in 1933, they were not prepared for what they found. The Wai Valley alone contained more than 1 million people who had never seen a white face, never encountered metal, and had been conducting sophisticated agriculture in the highland valleys for 9,000 years, longer than any civilization in Europe had existed. Among these highland peoples, the Chimbu were regarded with a particular kind of fear by their neighbors. Their warriors painted their bodies white, blackened their eyes, and decorated their faces to resemble the dead. When the Chimbu arrived at the edge of an enemy village at dusk, what the defenders saw was not a raiding party. It was the Walking Dead. The psychological effect was documented specifically. Defenders who had fought other Highlanders without breaking would scatter in panic from the Chimbu before a single weapon was raised. The Chimbu had developed the ghost warrior strategy not from superstition, but from precise psychological calculation. They understood that an enemy's fighting capacity was not purely physical. It was cognitive. A mind convinced it was facing something outside the natural order did not function. The strategy worked because it was true. Human beings confronted with the genuinely unexpected stopped thinking clearly. The Chimbu had turned that biological reality into military doctrine thousands of years before Western military theory would give it a name. Australian colonial authorities spent years documenting Highland warfare before banning it, not because the violence was unusual by the standards of the era, but because the sophistication of it unsettled their existing frameworks. These were supposed to be Stone Age people. They were not supposed to have doctrine. When metal tools reached Chimbu communities, the first thing they did was improve their agricultural terracing. The second thing they did was improve their weapons. The pattern repeated across the highlands. Contact with the outside world was absorbed and redirected by existing cultural frameworks faster than colonial administrators could track. Decades of missionary activity converted the majority of Chimbu communities to Christianity. The ghost warrior rituals were declared incompatible with Christian belief and largely abandoned. But the underlying strategy, the understanding that psychological dominance precedes physical victory, did not disappear. It migrated. Chimbu politicians in the modern Papua New Guinea parliament are documented as some of the most tactically sophisticated operators in the country. They negotiate with the same principles their ancestors used to paralyze enemies at dusk. The costume changed. The calculation did not. Number 5. The Jarawa, the choice and its cost. For most of the 20th century, the Jarawa of the Andaman Islands behaved almost identically to their neighbors, the Sentinelese. They attacked every outsider who came near. They destroyed equipment. They killed. The Indian government formally designated their territory off-limits and maintained that designation for decades. Then, in 1998, something shifted. A small group of Jarawa children appeared at the edge of the forest near a coastal road and accepted coconuts from a passing boat. They did not attack. They did not retreat. They stood at the boundary of their world and made a different choice than every generation before them had made. Within a few years, contact had expanded. Jarawa individuals were appearing near settlements, accepting food, allowing photographs. The Indian government, caught between its official protection policy and the reality of sustained contact, did not know what to do. It responded the way governments generally do when faced with decisions that have no good options. It stalled. What followed the Jarawa's decision to open has been documented carefully by researchers and advocacy groups. Poachers immediately began using the Jarawa's new openness to access their forest, which sits on top of one of the most resource-rich territories in the Andaman chain. The road that cuts through Jarawa territory, built decades earlier and never properly closed, became a route for organized tours. Tourists were documented throwing food to Jarawa people from vehicle windows, the way visitors to a safari park throw food to animals. Disease arrived, measles, respiratory infections. The Jarawa, like every isolated population at first contact, had no immune resistance to common pathogens. Children died from illnesses that would have been treated with over-the-counter medicine anywhere else in India. The Sentinelese watched the Jarawa's experience from across the water and drew the only conclusion the evidence supported. They have not changed their policy. The anthropologists who have studied both communities have written about this with a specific kind of exhaustion. The Jarawa chose contact. The system that greeted their choice was not prepared, not ethical, and not safe. The Sentinelese chose isolation and are criticized internationally for the violence with which they maintain it. There was no version of this story in which indigenous people got to decide the terms of their own survival. The only variable was which kind of damage they received. Number 6. The Kawahiva, a tribe being hunted right now. This is not a story about the past. The Kawahiva of the Brazilian Amazon are being killed today. Not metaphorically, not gradually, today. The Kawahiva are one of the last truly uncontacted tribes in Brazil. They live in the state of Mato Grosso, in a shrinking fragment of forest surrounded by agricultural expansion, illegal logging operations, and land speculators who understand that the most efficient way to claim indigenous land is to ensure there is no one left to claim it. FUNAI, the Brazilian government agency responsible for protecting indigenous peoples, has drone footage and ground-level photographs of Kawahiva communities, small groups moving quickly through the forest, always moving, never staying long enough to be found by the people searching for them. FUNAI officers who have tracked them report the same thing every time. Signs of a community that has learned to leave no trace, that breaks camp at the first indication of outside presence, that is surviving not through confrontation, but through disappearance. Former FUNAI officer José Carlos Mireles, who spent decades working to protect uncontacted tribes in Brazil, has stated publicly that the Kawahiva are not avoiding contact because they are unaware the outside world exists. They are avoiding contact because they know exactly what contact means. They have seen what happened to neighboring communities. They have found the evidence of what happens when isolated forest peoples encounter land speculators who need their territory empty. Brazil's political environment has not been consistently friendly to indigenous land protections. Periods of aggressive enforcement have been followed by periods in which FUNAI's budget was cut, its staff reduced, and its legal protections quietly weakened. During those periods, the pressure on Kawahiva territory intensified measurably. There are people alive in that forest right now who have never seen a city, never used electricity, and whose entire existence depends on a buffer zone of legal protection that is contested every year by economic interests with far more political leverage than any tribal protection agency possesses. If the Kawahiva disappear, it will not make major news. It never does. The last members of a contacted Amazonian tribe, the last speaker of a language, the last keeper of a ceremony, typically die in a government resettlement village, in poverty, in conditions that bear no relationship to the world their grandparents lived in. Their deaths are documented in academic papers that very few people read. The forest that sustained them for thousands of years is plowed under for soybeans before the ink dries. Number 7. The Pintupi 9, the last first contact on Earth. The year was 1984. The space shuttle had already flown. MTV was 2 years old. The first Apple Macintosh had just been released, and in the western desert of Australia, 9 people walked out of the wilderness and encountered the modern world for the first time in their lives. The Pintupi 9, a family group of 3 women, 1 man, and 5 children, had been living in the Gibson Desert with no knowledge that the rest of their people had left the desert for government settlements decades earlier. They had not been isolated by choice or by policy. They simply had not known. The desert is enormous. The distances involved are not distances that fit inside most people's imaginations. When they were found by a group from an Aboriginal settlement that included a Pintupi man named Pinta Pinta, who recognized signs of their presence, the encounter was not between indigenous people and white researchers. It was between relatives who had lost each other across 40 years and 500 kilometers of desert. Pinta Pinta called out in Pintupi. The family emerged from hiding slowly, cautiously, and then with the recognition that comes when you hear your own language from the mouth of a stranger. They had maintained every traditional practice across their isolation. They knew the locations of water sources across hundreds of kilometers. They carried their entire material culture in their hands, digging sticks, grinding stones, wooden bowls. Their knowledge of the desert was so precise and so complete that the researchers who documented the encounter described it as watching people operate in their perfect environment. They were not surviving the desert, they were at home in it. What happened next followed the same pattern that has followed every first contact in Australia's documented history. The Pintupi Nine were brought to the settlement at Kiwir. They encountered flour, sugar, and refined carbohydrates for the first time. Within years, the metabolic diseases that follow refined Western food into previously isolated communities began appearing. The youngest children were enrolled in the education system. Yari Yari, the man at the head of the family, was documented by researchers as a person of extraordinary knowledge and authority within his own world. In the settlement context, he had none of the social tools that knowledge required to function. The desert that his expertise was built for was still there. It had not moved, but the world around it had rearranged itself in ways that made his expertise increasingly difficult to use. The last people on Earth to make first contact did so in the same year the world was building the internet. The gap between those two facts is not history. It is a single human lifetime. Number 8. The Nenets, the reindeer people and the melting world. Every spring, the Nenets of northwestern Siberia make one of the longest land migrations on Earth. Across 1,200 kilometers of frozen tundra, they move with their reindeer herds from the forests of the south toward the Arctic coast, then back again in autumn. The route is not chosen each year. It was established by ancestors across thousands of years of accumulated knowledge about where the lichen grows, where the ice is safe, where the river crossings are shallow enough to cross with a herd. The Nenet's body has been shaped by this environment in measurable ways. Their metabolic rate at rest is significantly higher than the European average. Their cardiovascular systems maintain peripheral circulation at temperatures that cause functional impairment in other populations. Their lung capacity is above normal range. These are not cultural adaptations. They are genetic ones, accumulated across the same Arctic pressures that rebuilt the Inuit body in North America. Different people, different continent, same environment, producing the same solutions. The knowledge that makes the migration possible cannot be learned from a book. It cannot be taught in a classroom. It exists in the language, in the route itself, in the specific names given to specific features of the landscape that contain information about conditions, dangers, and timing. Nenets, reindeer herders, navigate the tundra using a mental map of thousands of kilometers that is not written anywhere, because the landscape itself is the document. The permafrost is thawing. That sentence does not adequately convey what is happening. The frozen ground that has been the foundation of the tundra ecosystem for 10,000 years is becoming unstable. River crossings that were always crossings are now open water. Lichen pastures that supported the herds for generations are drowning under standing water released from thawing ground. The route that was established by thousands of years of accumulated knowledge is changing faster than knowledge can keep pace with. Soviet collectivization programs in the mid-20th century forcibly settled Nenets communities and removed their children to state boarding schools, following the same template deployed against the Chukchi and every other indigenous Siberian people. The children who came back had broken language chains. They spoke Russian better than Nenets, and they had missed the years during which the tundra knowledge was supposed to enter them. Today, Nenets herders are watching two crises converge simultaneously. The climate is dissolving the environment their bodies and knowledge were built for, and the generation that should be learning the route from their elders is being pulled toward cities, toward the Russian economy, toward a world that does not have a practical use for a mental map of 1,000 kilometers of melting tundra. The reindeer still move, the herders still follow, but the ice beneath that route is not the ice it was, and the children who will need to know where the new crossings are have not yet been taught to read a landscape that does not sit still anymore. Number 9. The Spinifex people, Ground Zero forgotten. In 1953, the British government detonated a nuclear weapon in the Australian desert. Then they did it again, and again. Between 1952 and 1963, 12 nuclear tests were conducted on Australian soil, in a desert that the British government had officially designated uninhabited. It was not uninhabited. The Spinifex people, Pila Nguru, had lived in that desert for 50,000 years. They were still there in 1953. Some of them walked through the fallout zones on foot. Others watched the sky change from colors it had never been before. They had no concept of radiation. They had no warning. The British government had conducted surveys of the area and received reports indicating that indigenous people were present in the test zones. The tests proceeded. The Australian government did not formally acknowledge that the Spinifex people existed as a legal entity with land rights until 1997, when a native title determination recognized their claim to approximately 55,000 square kilometers of the Great Victoria Desert, including the land their ancestors had been forcibly removed from for nuclear testing. When Spinifex community members returned to their traditional country after recognition, they found contaminated sites still present in the landscape. Radioactive material had not been cleaned up. The British government's position was that cleanup was Australia's responsibility. Australia's position involved considerable ambiguity. The land remained as it had been left, marked, contaminated, and formally recognized as belonging to a people who had no part in what had been done to it. The Spinifex people had survived in the Great Victoria Desert, one of the harshest environments on Earth, using a knowledge system that encoded water locations, edible plants, hunting strategies, and navigation in ceremony, song, and story. The song lines that mapped their country were not metaphor. They were a functional navigation system that worked across hundreds of kilometers of landscape that could kill an unprepared person within days. Spinifex elders who were alive during the nuclear tests described the experience in later testimonies as the arrival of something that had no name and no place in their understanding of how the world worked. They had a framework for drought, for flood, for fire. They had no framework for a light that turned the sky white and left the ground wrong. The British government issued a formal acknowledgement of suffering to Aboriginal people affected by the nuclear tests in 2023, 70 years after the first detonation. Most of the people who walked through the fallout are dead. Their children carry what their bodies absorbed. The desert holds what was left behind. And the formal acknowledgement, when it finally came, contained no mechanism for cleanup, no binding commitment to remediation, and no figure that anyone involved described as adequate. Number 10. The Sentinelese, the only rational conclusion. North Sentinel Island sits in the Bay of Bengal, visible from passing ships, unreachable by anyone who values their life. It is approximately the size of Manhattan. It has been continuously inhabited for 60,000 years. We know almost nothing about the people who live there, and that is entirely their choice. The Sentinelese have killed every person who has come close enough to kill. They shot arrows at a helicopter the Indian government sent to check for survivors after the 2004 tsunami. They buried 2 fishermen who drifted onto their beach. They drove away every research vessel that approached within range. They have not varied this policy across the entirety of recorded contact history, which stretches back to the 19th century. In 2018, a 26-year-old American named John Allen Chow paid Andaman fishermen to bring him to the island. He believed he had been called by God to bring Christianity to the Sentinelese. The fishermen brought him to shallow water and remained at a safe distance. Chow waded ashore and was shot at immediately. He returned to the boat. The next morning, he waded ashore again. The fishermen watched from the water as he was killed on the beach. They returned to shore and reported what they had seen. Several missionary organizations described Chow posthumously as a martyr. The people who killed an illegal intruder on their own territory became, in the missionary framing, the aggressors. Multiple organizations announced that his death had strengthened their resolve to reach the Sentinelese. The killing of a man who had violated their island was used as justification to plan further violations. To understand why the Sentinelese policy is not savagery but strategy, you have to look at what is visible from their beach. The Andaman Islands contained approximately 5,000 Great Andamanese people when the British established a penal colony there in 1858. By 1900, fewer than 25 remained. The Onge dropped from 600 to under 100. The Jarawa, who abandoned isolation, immediately faced poaching, disease, and tourists throwing food from car windows. The Sentinelese did not need researchers to explain any of this to them. They could see it. They watched their neighbors across the water make different choices and receive different versions of the same outcome. Their arrows are not the response of people who do not understand the world. They are the response of people who understand it with a precision that has kept them alive for 60,000 years, while every civilization around them rose, collapsed, and was replaced by something that claimed to be better. The most sophisticated thing about the Sentinelese is not their bows or their survival instinct. It is that they looked at everything the outside world had to offer, weighed it against everything they could see it had done to everyone who accepted it, and said no, clearly, consistently. For longer than most nations have existed, these are not ancient stories preserved in textbooks. Every tribe in this list is still navigating the consequences of what happened to them. Right now, today, on the same planet you woke up on this morning, there are people living in tree houses, herding reindeer across thawing ice, hiding in forests being logged around them, and standing on beaches with arrows drawn. The story the outside world tells about these peoples almost always follows the same shape. The isolated tribe, the dramatic first contact, the slow assimilation, the bittersweet loss of a way of life. That framing is not neutral. It makes what happened sound like weather. Inevitable. Nobody's fault. Simply the way things go when the modern world reaches the last places it has not yet touched. But weather does not send boarding school administrators to beat children for speaking their own language. Weather does not detonate nuclear weapons in deserts that surveys already identified as inhabited. Weather does not terminate CIA support for guerrilla fighters overnight without warning because a diplomatic relationship became more valuable than the people who trusted you. What happened to the Korowai, the Ainu, the Kawahiva, the Spinifex people, and every other people in this list was not the inevitable friction of cultural collision. It was a series of deliberate decisions made by governments, institutions, and individuals who understood exactly what they were doing and chose to do it anyway. And the cruelest truth, the one that the original stories keep circling back to, is this. The damage rarely came only from outside. The Kuna used their revolution to execute collaborators. The Naga manufactured enemies when just wars ran out. The cargo cults identified internal contaminants and destroyed them. The mechanisms of survival, pushed hard enough for long enough, begin producing the same violence they were built to resist. Every culture in this list built something extraordinary. A language with no word for the future. A house 40 meters in the sky. A migration route memorized across 1,000 kilometers of tundra. A policy of absolute sovereignty maintained for 60,000 years. These are not the artifacts of peoples who failed to develop. They are the achievements of peoples who solved the problem of survival under conditions the rest of humanity never had to face. What was done to them afterward is not a footnote to those achievements. It is the part of the story that the world called civilized most urgently needs to sit with. Because civilization, as it turns out, is not defined by the presence of cities and technology and legal systems. It is defined by what you do when you encounter a people who have built something different from what you built, and whether your first instinct is to learn from it or to erase it. The answer, across almost every story in this list, was the same, and we are still living in the consequences.